Since the dawn of time, mankind has searched for a higher meaning. And in this search, he has at times put aside his differences to meet equals in competition. These competitions call for skill, speed, and strength. A battle of wits and athleticism, of heart and soul, the most ancient of team rituals, and one most human in nature. We call it sport.
Which is why, when the first video game was made, it emulated a sport, or depending on who you ask, it may or may not have been the first. Anyway, point is, sports have quite literally been made into video games since the dawn of computerized gaming. Day one, hour one, minute one. It's the simplest of concepts. Score points by going over there. If it is a major sport, probably also been made into a video game. Recently, I picked up Old Time Hockey, which is a PC and PS4 title to be on Xbox One. PC gaming has unfortunately been at the end of an EA embargo since 2009, or as they deem PC as too small a market for the NHL franchise, which is dumb. But I think it's fair to say that a game called Old Time Hockey wasn't aiming to snatch up that market, though definitely is going to feed off it. However, the way the game has been put together, I felt the need to talk about it, particularly about the concepts of simulation and presentation in video games, as it pertains to Old Time Hockey. For the uninitiated, hockey is somewhat different from most sports, as it is played on ice. It utilizes a special game ball called a puck, which is not really a ball. 12 men and you've got yourself a good old-fashioned cluster puck. It's not that simple is what I'm saying. So when you make a game about hockey, and the game is represented by dots, blocks, and lines, sometimes you need to take some liberties with how the game is represented. You don't try to simulate, you change presentation, you get creative, make it arcade-like, make it well-polished but simple, present it differently. And that's what early sports games were. They were simplified games which represented the actual game. In the very simplest core mechanics of hockey, you pass, you shoot, you score, and then you repeat, if time allows. Damn it, phone. None of this controlling your stick, choosing skating backwards, different pokes, passes, dekes, wide to hold, to celebrate, beat, to change the line. It was simple simulation instead of realistic simulation. This is where Old Time Hockey comes in. Let me tell you first what I was expecting. A game that played like Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey. Something simple, quick, but fun. It is a little bit different. Old Time Hockey is presented as a loose interpretation of modern hockey, a caricature of hockey in a different time, an almost lawless time. Presentation isn't everything, ask Dwarf Fortress, but it's always a good first impression. Often presentation is the first impression people have. It was the presentation that caught my attention, honestly, because any hockey game is going to have a couple schmucks with sticks and skates on the ice. But if you present it differently, you've got my attention. This is why presentation is an important part of games. You're not going to get me, Mr. General Population, to buy a game that faithfully simulates curling. It just doesn't reach me as a normal person. But you change the presentation, you change the likelihood of people buying. Sports games are plagued with standardized expectations. They don't usually take risks. There isn't a need to exceed, just succeed, for yearly game devs. This is why Old Time Hockey is a breath fresh of air. Breath fresh of air. In Old Time Hockey, you have fake teams, fake players with fake names, and who gives a crusty winger about the rules? You're thrown into the world of Bush League hockey, and man, the presentation of BHL is great. Sparse helmets, hip checks everywhere, fighting constantly, small stadiums, small crowds. It's like they were making a slapshot game but couldn't get the rights. It's different, but throughout my time playing, I can't help but feel a little underwhelmed. It's just that besides a decent presentation, the game muddles gameplay. If you've played a few games of NHL whatever from the last few years and then come and play OTH, Old Time Hockey, it's not going to feel right. And even if you haven't played an EA NHL game recently, you should be able to notice the cracks in the armor as well. I can't help but feel the game doesn't really know what it wants to be, silly or simulated, simple or complex. The setting, while fun, appears to be the backdrop for an NHL clone whose gameplay is supplemented by hard hits, cartoon-like styling, fighting, and cutscenes. These things are saving an otherwise subpar simulation. Pucks are lofty and heavy, passing is muddled, skating is slow and tedious, AI is not good. They flounder on both sides, switching between players is not intuitive. Often choosing players you don't want to be or switching way too slowly. On top of that, the camera sometimes just doesn't work. It gives you nothing useful to look at. All the action ends up off the screen. Even when the game structure has been simplified, one button to pass, one to shoot, the mechanics are not quite there. EA's NHL, even though it's a bit more complicated, still has mechanics down. Remember, the NHL series has been built off of meeting expectations, so it's going to be a little bit hard for NHL gamers to see past the subpar simulation. Remember how I mentioned I was expecting something like Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey? Well, we all know that was a personal expectation. It wasn't one that I necessarily needed to have for this game. But this came about because of the way that this game is presented to potential buyers. It's placing it more along the spectrum with arcade-like games, not so much with the simulation-type games. I mean, the game's official website is arcadehockey.com. There's no way of misconstruing that, right? But as we've seen, this game is modeled heavily after EA's NHL games, and if it's going to model itself after that system, there's no way it's ever going to feel right to those consumers of that product. And while we're talking about the NHL series, a lot of silly stylistic things that old-time hockey does can be done in NHL 17. The last NHL game I played. Connected hits feel better in NHL, and celebrations are stacked heavily in favor of NHL. So even the things that old-time hockey prides itself in having are available in current NHL titles. Fights in NHL are more complex, better fleshed out. Fights in old-time hockey are very stiff and are simple 3 hits you're out fights with the occasional 1. If anything, this is where the game should have tried to go a little bit more bonkers. Hell, Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey on the N64 did it better. Have fights take a bit more center stage, especially if they're going to stop play entirely. A good example of how this can be done well is Super Blood Hockey. The game is much more simple than old-time hockey. It's an obvious spiritual successor to the NES Ice Hockey game. But the fights are a much more important central part of the game. Different sized players have better stamina, punches, or HP, skating is slower, and shots don't really stack up often, so fighting takes a much larger stage in the game as every player stops and fights. And the consequence to the loser of the fight is they lose a player completely. It's simple, but fun. Old-time hockey fights aren't fun, they're dumb. Yeah, you can get injured in fights in OTH, which will change play. Players still play, but sometimes they miss a pass or shot, which honestly just makes the already muddled gameplay that much more annoying. And, come on guys, this game doesn't even look like it was made in 2017. 6th generation graphics aren't gonna always cut it, especially when some 6th generation games look better cel-shaded than whatever cel-shaded-like system this is. I'm actually pretty bummed that old-time hockey isn't able to find a good balance. There is something here to like, actually. I like a lot about it, and I can see the developers have poured a lot of heart into this. And this is what bothers me more, is that this game, for all the stylistic risks it took, tried so hard to embrace 2 entirely different types of game styles, in some weird attempt to attract gamers who grew up playing games like Blades of Steel, and the modern NHL gamers. Look, I'm going to try and avoid scoring this game because what I think is more important is the lesson to take away from it. I think the general consensus anyway is similar across the board. I would want to chalk this up more as an example of when pandering can wreak havoc on a game. I think in the end, if I'm going to look for that perfect balance of silly presentation with simple masterful mechanics, I'll just play Rocket League.